Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into the story of a specific street gang, White Fence.
That's right. We're looking at its history, how it evolved.
Exactly. We've got a Wikipedia entry as our main source here.
A pretty detailed one, actually.
Yeah, it looks like it. And the goal really is to pull out the most, interesting bits about this group, give everyone a good handle on their origins and what makes them tick.
Mm-hmm. A concise overview, but thorough. It's a fascinating slice of LA history we're digging into.
Okay, so let's get right to the beginning then. The source points way back. Says White Fence started around 1900 in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's the claim, around 1900.
Right.
Which is, a very long time ago for any group in this city.
Definitely.
Though it seems like the gang itself, as a recognizable thing, probably emerged more in the 1910s.
Ah, okay, so the early 1900s is maybe more foundational.
Kind of. And what's really interesting is how it apparently started, as an all-male sports team.
A sports team?
Yeah, connected to La Purissima Church.
Wow, okay. A church sports team evolving into a street gang. That's quite a turn. How did that happen?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
This initial group, they were called the La Purissima Crowd.
Makes sense. Linked to the church.
Exactly. And over time, the name shifted, became White Fence.
And that name came from?
Literally, the white picket fence around the church, La Purissima Church.
Huh. So a very direct physical landmark connection.
Right. Very grounded, like you said before. But there's certainly another layer to it.
Oh.
Yeah, the source mentions this other interpretation of the name. More symbolic, maybe?
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It suggests White Fence was also seen as a kind of symbolic barrier.
A barrier between who?
Between the white residents and the Hispanic residents in Boyle Heights back then.
Okay. Reflecting the times.
Exactly. It was a period with, a lot of racial tension in that area. So the name might have captured that divide.
So it's got this dual meaning then. Physical fence, social fence.
Pretty much. It really speaks to the complex situation. Community ties on one hand, social division on the other. That seems to have shaped their early identity.
That is quite loaded for just a name. Okay, moving forward a bit. What's their overall place in LA history? And territory, where were they mainly based?
Well, just being one of the oldest gangs in LA makes them historically significant, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And by the 1950s, 1960s, they'd really built a reputation. Considered one of the most violent and powerful gangs in East Los Angeles.
Okay, so a major player by the mid-century.
Definitely. Their core territory, their long-established base, is Boyle Heights.
Which is right there next to East LA.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a really deep-rooted presence in that specific part of the city.
But it sounds like maybe they didn't just stay in Boyle Heights. The source suggests they spread out quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. Boyle Heights is the heartland, you could say. But
yeah.
The info mentions activity all over. East LA, West LA, even Hollywood.
Hollywood.
And beyond California, too. Las Vegas, El Paso, even Florida, and into Mexico, Central America.
Whoa, okay. That's some serious reach. From a church sports team in Boyle Heights to international presence.
It really makes you wonder about the factors behind that kind of expansion over decades.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you mentioned power and violence that usually involve conflict. Who were their main rivals? Did they have allies too?
Right. Gangs don't exist in a vacuum. And White Fence has, well, a really long and complex history of conflict. Especially one rivalry.
Which one is that?
Their feud with El Hoyo Maravilla. This one goes way back.
How far back?
To the 1930s. It's considered one of the longest continuous gang rivalries in all of Los Angeles.
The 1930s, so we're talking generations involved in this.
Exactly. Think about that. Grandparents, parents, kids, potentially all caught up in the same conflict over nearly a century.
That's hard to even wrap your head around. Just an enduring feud. Were there other major rivals besides El Hoyo Maravilla?
Oh, yeah. The list is pretty long, according to the source. It includes basically all the Maravilla sets.
And sets meaning, just for clarity.
Right. So Maravilla is like a larger network or affiliation of gangs, mostly in East LA. And sets are the individual neighborhood groups within that. They often have their own specific names and turfs.
Got it. So rivals with all those Maravilla groups. Anyone else?
Yep. Barrio Nuevo Estrada, Armenian Power, other gangs known as Flats gangs.
Less gangs.
Yeah, it often refers to gangs that aren't necessarily tied into a larger prison gang structure, sometimes more neighborhood focused, and also Florencia 13.
Okay, so a very active conflict landscape, let's say.
That paints a picture, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Lots of territorial fights, power struggles over many, many years.
definitely. What about the other side? Any significant alliances mentioned?
Yes, some key ones. The source points to alliances with the Mexican mafia.
Okay, that's a major player in the prison system and on the streets.
Huge influence, yeah. That alliance often shapes rules and hierarchies for Southern California gangs.
Yeah.
So it positions White Fence within that larger structure.
And any others?
It also mentions alliances with certain Sureño sets.
Right. The Southern California Hispanic gangs often aligned under the Sureño banner, often tied to the Mexican mafia.
Exactly. But these things can shift,
Oh.
you know. Alliances aren't always permanent. Depends on what's happening inside prisons, on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
It's a constantly changing network.
Sure. Makes sense. Okay, so we've covered origins, territory, enemies, allies. What about just, like, defining characteristics? What made White Fence stand out?
Well, as we said, they're predominantly a Mexican-American street gang that reflects Boyle Heights, where they started.
Right, the demographics of the area.
But maybe more striking, the source says White Fence was among the first gangs in East LA to use firearms.
Really? Early adopters of guns.
Seems so. And also things like chains, other dangerous weapons. This was pretty early on.
That must have been a significant shift.
You'd think so, right? It probably gave them a serious advantage in fights back then, and likely contributed to that reputation they developed by the 50s and 60s as being particularly formidable or violent.
Yeah, introducing firearms changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it? Probably
Yeah.
forced other groups to react to.
Almost certainly had a ripple effect.
The source also mentioned an acronym.
Oh, yeah. WF. They're often known just as WF.
Simple enough, common for gangs to use acronyms.
Very common. Just another way to identify themselves. Shorthand.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We started with this group linked to a church sports team back in the 1910s.
La Purissima Crowd.
Right. Then the name changes to White Fence, which points to the church fence, but maybe also reflects those social, racial divides in Boyle Heights at the time.
That dual meaning, yeah.
Then they grow, become known as one of the most powerful and violent gangs in East LA by the mid-20th century.
Rooted in Boyle Heights, but spreading out.
With this incredibly long, bitter rivalry with El Hoyo Maravilla starting way back in the 30s, plus lots of other conflicts.
And key alliances, like with the Mexican mafia.
And this interesting detail about being early users of firearms and heavier weapons in the area.
Known as WF. It really paints a picture of a gang deeply, deeply woven into the fabric of LA's history, doesn't it?
It really does. It's fascinating how something starting so locally, like that sports team,
Yeah. Seemingly small beginnings.
could evolve over a century into this group with such a significant and often violent footprint. It reflects both community connection and, well, intense conflict.
A real microcosm of some of the larger forces at play in the city's development.
So for everyone listening, thinking about White Fence's story, it really is a window into LA's history. The social changes, the demographic shifts, the tensions.
It shows how these groups form, how identities shift, how conflicts can persist for generations. It's not just an isolated story. It's part of that bigger LA narrative.
Absolutely. Which leads us to a final thought for you to consider.
Yeah, thinking about this long history, the changes, the alliances, those deep, deep rivalries, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
How does a story like White Fences reflect the bigger picture? You know, the massive social and demographic changes Los Angeles has gone through over the last 100+ years.
And are there other long-standing groups out there, maybe ones we don't hear about as much, that have gone through similar kinds of transformations in how they see themselves, how they interact with others, adapting to the city changing around them?
Something to chew on. How do groups endure and change over such long periods within a dynamic city?